Tell us that story you shared with me about the discovery of that by the Americans and the Allied forces. You had some photographs of the original machine.
So this is one of the original machines discovered during the war. It started its life as a DC bias machine, and then during the war converted to AC bias. And so this is the report on the Allies did when they discovered these machines. It was very confusing to them. Because they were already aware of tape recording and that sort of work, but they didn't kind of understand the fidelity that they were hearing over the radio waves until they started to kind of take these things apart. They realized this small change that happened. So one of the people who brought a machine back was Jack Mullen. So he essentially, took a machine like this apart and stuck it in a suitcase and brought it back. And so he used it initially to do some Bing Crosby recordings and such, because Bing didn't like recording to discs because he wanted to be able to edit and things like that. But eventually, Jack Mullen also helped the Ampex company get into tape making. And so this is the first of the Ampex tape machines that was used professionally.
And you actually have some tape on there that's from the 40s.
Yeah, so this is a vintage tape that we were just looking at. So it's interesting, they were using this German tape machine as a guide, essentially. And so they copied a number of things that they saw. Some were great and some not so great. So one of the things they copied was the B-wind heads. So essentially the tape is backwards to any modern tape machine. So instead of the oxide facing away from you, it faces towards you. And the big problem with this is it's hard to make edits because it's hard to mark the tape. So you have to mark it in back of the head through a little viewing hole here. So they copied the wind type, and then also the idea of the flanges and things like that. But eventually, the B-wind's a very awkward approach to be able to do editing that they sent an upgrade out. So then they just switched all these machines to A-wind, just plop this there instead.
So now you can see what you're doing as you're marking an edit.
Exactly, yeah. And I think initially, when these were developed, they were mostly doing long programs, and so they weren't thinking, a lot of the fast edits and that sort of thing that eventually was intended to do.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why this is one of the most pivotal moments. So we were able to record much more subtle signals with the electrification in the last video, but you still weren't able to edit anything. In fact, if you were to rewind and play back something on a wax cylinder, you would instantly destroy it. Over here, you're able to rewind, play it back, but you're also able to cut out sections, splice sections together, which opened up a whole new way to capture and eventually to create down the road.
Right. Yeah, so they were doing editing almost from the get-go. So here's an example of a mono head. It's a very simple early head. You can see the coils on each side, and then here's the gap in the middle. But eventually, just added thinner heads and stacked them on top of each other, and that gives you multi-track recording. So first stereo 2-track, and then 3-track half-inch, and then 4-track and 8-track, and yeah. It was a much easier means of doing multi-track, essentially because it's on the same tape. You can edit all the tracks together, and it's simple that way. So this is a vintage tape on here, and the old tapes ran at 30 inches per second, and because the heads were so crude, the gap was kind of wide. It had to run that fast, but eventually they improved the heads, and they went down to it at 15 IPS, so they get more time on a reel.
Can you play us a clip?
Yeah. Let's see how this goes. Takes a while to get started.
That sounds remarkably good for how old it is.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very expensive machine. I forget the exact amount, but I think it was like $5,000 in 1948, which is probably a small house at the time. And so it was really it's all Longevin transformers and very sophisticated. Uses big spooling motors and a big drive motor, and so they really went all out on this machine. So the next machine, the 300 that came out shortly after, was smaller and a lot less expensive. And so that's really, so along with being able to edit and the beginnings of multi-track and all these things, the other big thing it did was to kind of democratize sound recording in a way, because before this it was all disc recording, and making wax and shaving wax and all these things require a big studio, and so it's really hard to do it on a small scale. But all of a sudden, if you have a tape machine and a microphone, almost that's all you need at that point. And so things really started to change in the 1950s. That's where you kind of the beginning of the Audio Engineering Society, the beginning of periodicals where you can read about sound recording. It kind of exploded at that point.
Yeah, and it obviously, you're able to edit. That really impacted the way music was made, the way any sort of media was made. You're able to layer tracks, which now at this point, with the third pivotal moment of the DAW in digital editing, that's gone even to a higher limit. But the idea that you can record one part, add on another part, change that other part, mute some things, listen to things in isolation, that's all changed the way music is created. And obviously with that third pivotal moment, the digitalization of it all, that even further democratized the recording.